Good morning, everyone. Joining in on Radio Sophia, the platform where we discuss and debate on issues within and beyond the boundaries of classrooms. We are living in times when the COVID-19 pandemic has made life synonymous with war, and every war brings into question issues of governance. The two constants of human life are suddenly endangered: oxygen and water. Oxygen, whose scarcity is all over the news, and water, which is waging a silent, lonely war. To discuss about the issues on water governance, we are indeed privileged to have amongst us one of our esteemed PhD alums and currently the Director of Observer Research Foundation, Kolkata, Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. A natural resource economist and econometrician by training, Dr. Ghosh obtained his PhD from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and certification in water diplomacy from the Harvard University, MIT Tufts University sponsored program. One of the leading ecological economists and development analysts of South Asia, is considered a pioneer in the application of neoclassical and heterodox economics in water governance. He has held several prestigious positions in the past, including being the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the Multi Commodity Exchange Limited in Mumbai, and also as a Professor of Econometrics at the Dietary School of Advanced Studies in New Delhi. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invite as we look forward to a really insightful session. Over to you, sir.
Pleasure is entirely mine. Let me thank you, Himadri, and Radio Sophia, and the entire consortium of the PhD students of Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, for inviting me to deliver this particular talk. I'm just sharing the screen. Is it visible?
So the presentation is not yet. Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay. So before I get into the crux of the presentation, let me just get into a bit of history. In fact, when I was at your stage and started writing the PhD dissertation at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, there were two issues that, in fact, kept on harping me. Of course, the idea was that I'm going to write a PhD dissertation in the domain of natural resource economics. Though, in fact, I was not trained in natural resource economics at that point in time when I was about to start my PhD, but have worked in a World Bank funded project as a research associate for 2 years, just after completion of my master's in econometrics. But so this entire domain seemed quite a bit fascinating for me. Now, while working in the domain of natural resource economics, I found that probably we are using some neoclassical tools and looking at the entire domain of natural resource governance in a very reductionist manner. Reductionist in the sense, probably because economists have this, not only economists, most engineers and economists have this tendency of looking at things essentially by reducing them to a few numbers and maybe a few models. But possibly the real world seems to be much more complex. I'm using the term complex rather than using the term complicated, because complex problems essentially don't have solutions. They can only be resolved. So the real, as such, the problems of governance are complex problems, and they don't have solutions, but we have to essentially resolve complex problems. So we don't have, and the domain of natural resource governance turned out to be so complex, more so because of the intricate nature of first of all, the entire ecological sciences, which rests behind the natural resources, which leads to us thinking of the entire resource base as a usable resource for us. And when we start thinking of the fact that everything that is around us is, we have a right to use them. Now, water happened to be one of those. At one point in time, there was always this thinking that, well, 3/4 of 75% of the earth is water, so there is no water scarcity. But then, in fact, came the very neo-Malthusian thinking that, well, usable water is scarce. And then, in fact, it's not only across space that there is spatial scarcity all across, but water also has a temporal dimension. That is, over time, at different points in time in a year, you find different types of availability of water, especially, in fact, in this part of the world. I'm talking of South Asia to a large extent. And of course, in the global South, that has turned out to be a phenomenon. Now, one very critical problem that we keep on facing with this entire Neo-Malthusian creed, which essentially started talking of water or trying to address water in the context of scarcity, is that it is not only scarcity that leads to disputes, but there are some things more than scarcity that essentially creates problems for us. That is why, in fact, in 2009, I recall in one of the papers that Jayanto Bandyopadhyay and I wrote, especially on the Himalayan water system, we essentially stated that one of the biggest governance and developmental challenges in this part of the world, especially while looking at the Himalayan water system, is that it's a system of ample water and ample poverty. Is this a development paradox, that more resource and more poverty is existing in this part of the world? Now, on the other hand, when I go back to the term water war, you will find that this term is being used over almost the last 70 years, ever since the 1950s, especially after Israel, particularly the MENA region, Middle East and North African region. Israel crossed the water barrier scale. In fact, in the 1960s, Jordan crossed the water barrier scale in the 70s, and Syria almost during the same time. Indeed, if you look at the situation, in fact, in the Jordan Yarmouk Basin, the situation is pretty bad. But even then, despite the fact that I'm going to talk about water wars, let me declare that there has not been a single water war in the history of modern civilization. War in the sense, the way we literally understand war, at least in the domain of strategic studies, international relations, and international geopolitics. So what kind of water war am I talking of? Essentially, I'm talking of a war, or rather, I will be talking of a war in the context of a war of paradigms of governance as far as water is concerned. Now, as I stated, that there was a point in time, and even today, this thinking prevails in large parts of the developing world and the global South, that water is scarce and scarcity of resource induces conflicts. This is a typical Malthusian, Neo-Malthusian creed, that it is scarcity that induces conflicts. Now, in fact, when I was writing my PhD dissertation, 2 decades back, I recognized one thing, that they resolved quite a, there was, of course, there were border skirmishes, there had been other forms of skirmishes, and it reached situations where, in fact, I mean, bullets were fired across the border. But in the 1994 Oslo Agreement, which is also turning out to be, which has turned out to be a successful agreement, at least the issue of water has been resolved between Israel, Syria, Palestine, and whosoever are the parties to that particular agreement. Now, even if you look at one of the model agreements when it comes to water, the best, I mean, any kind of institutional economic theory or international geopolitics or international strategic studies, they will always put across the example of Indus Water Treaty. Probably one of the most robust, well-drafted international water treaty that has been, international water agreement that has been that is in public domain so far, and that is in force so far. And despite a hostile relation between Pakistan and India, the Indus Water Treaty, or the issues as far as the Indus are concerned, are hardly, they of course come to the fore more as when you talk about using water as a weapon, but that has a different kind of connotation altogether. But because of the existence of the World Bank as a third party and the MIT president, the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is supposedly the adjudicator. If at all there is any kind of a dispute between over the Indus, I mean, somehow the deal gets straightened up. So you won't find that there is a better treaty than the Indus Water Treaty that prevails, in fact, in this part of the global south. On the other hand, as far as water is concerned, we are finding a different kind of war that has been waged. It's a war over paradigms. It's a war over paradigms or visions as far as the governance is concerned. Now, this war is not a very recent war. This has been prevailing over I would say, over the last 50 years, ever since the 1970s. Rather, I would say even prior to that, with this entire feeling that that water is scarce and scarcity induces conflicts, or with this entire neo-Malthusian creed dominating our water governance thinking, the approaches to govern water has primarily been, or supposed to govern the resource, has primarily been extremely Malthusian in nature. The response has been extremely Malthusian in nature. Since water is scarce, so you have to create more supplies. How do you create more supplies? You create more dams, you create more diversion channels, you create feeder canals, and eventually what you need to do, essentially those are going to be diverted towards the agricultural fields so that you can produce the water guzzlers like paddy, like sugarcane, like suppose say alfalfa in the western United States. So eventually this was the critical element. And in fact, one critical element which I essentially took up there while writing my PhD dissertation was that it is not really the scarcity of water that induces conflicts. Otherwise, the Middle East would have been in constant conflict. The North African region would have been in constant conflict over water. But it is essentially the value that water yields for you. If you put water to valuable use, loss of water or non-availability of water will result in valuable losses. And this is what I essentially call the scarcity value of water. So on the basis of
sorry to interrupt you, sir.
Am I audible?
Sorry. Sir, you are audible.
Yeah,
sir, are you by any chance changing the slides, or is the slides in the same
No, slide
place?
is constant.
Okay,
sir.
sir.
Slide is
Okay,
constant.
sir.
I have not.
Sure.
I'm just. It's on the title slide only.
Okay, sir.
So, so if you can hear my face moving, then you can make out that things are pretty okay.
Yes, sir. It's fine. It's fine.
Okay. So this is essentially how. So my contention out there was that it is not merely the physical scarcity of the resource that leads to conflicts, but it is the scarcity value of the resource that leads to conflicts. However, this didn't essentially, I mean, that work, which was later on published, in fact, in Water Policy and then Water Resources Research, and eventually was published as a book later on in 2006, 2007, didn't really entail the kind of water war that I'm going to speak today. Now, this paradigm was that prevailed so far and was brought to India by the British engineers was the reductionist traditional engineering paradigm. Now, the British engineers, they had one very moot point in mind. They had to somehow, in some way or the other, divert water to the fields, to the agricultural fields, ensure agricultural production, and eventually they have to ensure that in some way or the other, the crop doesn't fail, and the lagan that they are going to get, the revenue that they are going to get, is ensured throughout, suppose, throughout the regime, and throughout the duration of their regimes across the space and time. However, what they didn't recognize at that point in time, or European engineering didn't recognize or doesn't even recognize today, is that as far as whether the peninsular river system or the Himalayan river system, they are completely different from what prevails, in fact, in Europe, from the rivers of Europe or the United States of America. So when you look at a hydrograph is essentially an annual hydrograph is essentially a graph which shows you the flows of a particular river at one particular measuring station uh, across 12 months of a year. So where you collect data for last 30 or 50 years and eventually take an average, and that annual average hydrograph is being created out of that. So when they essentially looked at a hydrograph of an Indian river, they found something quizzical and something unprecedented for them. European rivers or the American rivers behave in a very orderly manner. The hydrograph is more or less horizontal. Throughout the year, they receive the same amount of water at one point at one specific station, and there is not much of an undulation or any form of upward or downward movement. But when they looked at, suppose, say, the Himalayan rivers, they were shocked. They found that there are two phenomena that exist. One phenomena that they call drought, the other phenomena that they call floods. And they found that, well, floods are problematic. And when they started using these diversion channels and created embankments throughout those diversion channels without understanding the nature of the rivers, often they found that the embankments were getting breached, and eventually the floods became a disaster. Now, floods are not supposed to be disasters. Floods are annual inundations. They're bound to happen. It's an ecological phenomenon. And any river or suppose say water is not really a stock of resource to be used for human stocking and appropriation as per human need. But it is part of the global eco-hydrological cycle. So floods and droughts, if not droughts, but high flows and low flows, to be more scientific, high flows and low flows in the Himalayan system or even in the peninsular river system are part of that eco-hydrological cycle. And there lay the problem. This was not recognized by them. This was not acknowledged by them because their traditional engineering thinking remained verities, and they went for flood control. They were aggravating the floods. Thereby, in fact, they simply couldn't acknowledge the fact that floods actually have certain ecosystem services or services provided by the ecosystem to the human community free of cost. Because essentially when the flood water recedes, it leaves behind rich alluvium, which actually has made the entire Gangetic plain the rice bowl of South Asia. And here lies a paradigmatic problem in governance. Now, in fact, when you look at Europe and United States of America, they have decommissioned more than 1,200 dams over the last 25 years when they started recognizing that the ecosystem is getting damaged because of the entire reductionist, constructionist thinking. And not only that, if the ecosystem gets damaged, it also affects the downstream community on the one hand, A. B, it also affects the fisheries, it affects soil formation, it affects human livelihoods. So the paradigm shift has already happened. So when they are thinking of any form of new water governance regime, they are taking into consideration the concerns of the downstream society, the broader concerns of the ecosystem, this is across space, as also the concerns that are going to arise across time. So time, temporal and spatial considerations become extremely important in this context. So let me now come to this particular diagram. Can you see the diagram? This portrays a social ecological system. You have the human system. This is a simplistic version of the social ecological system, but essentially what a social ecological system is much more complicated than that. The human system is considered to be embedded in the broader ecosystem, natural ecosystem. We are part of the natural ecosystem. The human system essentially, but just for our sake of understanding, I have simplified it. There are certain actions or interventions in the working of the natural ecosystem that the human system essentially exerts. So as humans, we often extract from the ecosystem food, we extract from the ecosystem fodder, we extract from the ecosystem water, we extract from the ecosystem fisheries. All these are ecosystem services, more specifically the provisioning services of the ecosystem. That is, whatever the ecosystem provides us in terms of quantity, in amounts. But there are other services of the ecosystem of which we are essentially indirect beneficiaries. Indirect, those are often those are classified as the indirect use values. Just as suppose the regulating services of the ecosystem, carbon sequestration done by a forest, and eventually because it is taking up the atmospheric carbon and absorbing that carbon and stocking the carbon, so naturally it is helping the entire human society, the human economy, by reducing the health cost, by increasing the productivity, reducing the number of morbid days. So that social cost of carbon somehow doesn't need to be incurred by the society as such. This is a regulating service of the ecosystem. Similarly, other forms of microclimate regulation, bringing down the temperature a bit. So then again, you have the other forms of what we call the supporting services of the ecosystem, which is like soil formation of a particular flow regime. Now, this was articulated by Jayanto Bandyopadhyay and me in a recent article. We called a flow regime, or we delineated a river flow regime as, especially in the context of the Himalayan rivers, as webs. This is also true for the peninsular rivers, not sufficiently true for the well, the European rivers, but they also carry a bit of sediment. But this is especially true if you talk about the Brahmaputra, Ganga, or Mekong, or suppose say, or suppose say the Salween or other Himalayan rivers. Webs essentially indicates the dynamic equilibrium of water, energy, biodiversity, and sediment. So if this dynamic equilibrium has to be maintained, then in fact we have a sufficient healthy flow regime, which precisely because the water by itself brings along with itself the sediment. So the river by itself is not merely the liquid flow, it also has a solid flow in the form of sediment. In the process, it sustains the biodiversity, whether that is, it also sustains the terrestrial biodiversity as well as the aquatic biodiversity. Now it has its energy, just as you intend to extract hydropower out of it. Now that energy with which it flows, if you want to extract that energy, have a hydropower project, it disrupts that equilibrium. So in that case, what happens? The sediment drops. The sediment cannot flow further downstream. The water flow regime for the downstream changes. The flow of the fish and other aquatic fish species, they are disrupted. When the sediment regime is also disrupted further downstream, what you don't have is the entire supporting service of soil formation. Now the delta by itself is formed by the sediments brought about from upstream. So, and on the other hand, one of the very critical examples happens to be the GBM delta, Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna delta, of which the Sundarbans archipelago happens to be a component. Now the Sundarbans has been shrinking. The GBM delta has been shrinking, and this shrinkage is primarily happening in the Ganges component of the delta. This is also because of a host of constructions that have happened further upstream till the Farakka. Right from Bhimgora, you have the Tehri further upstream, then you have the Bhimgora in Hardwar. Then further downstream, you have a host of other constructions. You have Kanpur, Narora, Kanpur, and many others. And finally, you have the Farakka, in fact, in West Bengal. Now, what is happening is that the entire sediment brought in, which would have been generated at the very upstream, they are getting trapped at the upstream of these constructions. Now, this needs to be empirically proven that the Ganges delta, that is the Ganges subdelta of the broader Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna delta, is largely, this is my contention, is largely formed by the sediments brought in by the Koshi from Nepal, which happens to be a tributary of the Ganga. Now, this sediment, which was flowing unimpeded maybe prior to the 1970s, and from 1975 that the Farakka became operational, prior to the 1970s, somehow this flow has been impeded because of the construction of the Farakka. On the other hand, what you have is sea level rise precisely because of forces of global warming and climate change. The dry season flow, as far as the natural channel of the Ganges is concerned, has also been, Ganges and its distributaries are concerned, which is flowing, the tidal creeks that are flowing to the delta, they have also been impeded largely, and there have been a huge amount of sedimentation, which has often led to closure of those channels. Now, what is happening is, because farther down the delta, the fresh water is not coming adequately, not flowing adequately. That is why the saline water is ingressing and taking its place. So, this is also because of the sea level rise. So, what is happening in the process is that the saline water, as the saline water takes its place, parts of the delta is going under the sea. And whatever is going on, there is land loss. Now, this land could have been resuscitated had the sediment been allowed to flow, but the sediment is not allowed to flow organically. So there is a pressure from both sides. One is sea level rise, which is essentially leading to shrinkage of the delta and lack of resuscitation of the land because of the impeded sediment flow. So what we have done is let's look at this diagram again, human actions and interventions in order to extract the extra benefits. Why was the Farakka barrage constructed? First of all, the Farakka barrage was constructed to resuscitate the Kolkata port, because the Kolkata port was getting sedimented, highly sedimented. In fact, the freshwater flow was low. And that is why the idea was that this freshwater flow through the Hooghly, if they can divert a certain portion of the water from the Farakka through a feeder canal to the Hooghly channel, that will flush out the sediments. And if that flushes out the sediments, then it becomes sufficiently navigable. However, that it has not helped the cause of the Kolkata port, but it has definitely aggravated the condition further downstream. So the folly of 1975 is being felt from 1990 onwards. And eventually we had the Ganges Water Agreement for dry season flow between Bangladesh and India, which talks of a specific flow regime, and India has to, especially for the dry season, starting from the month of this is essentially from starting from the month of November to March. Then, in fact, the problem arises elsewhere, that these human actions that were taking into consideration, the short-term gains are resulting in long-term losses. It is so, and the loss is a cost which has to be borne by the society as a whole. So it's the fishermen community, it is in fact the community in the Sundarbans, and over time, this can lead to some form of social conflicts or social uprising. Now, in fact, the vagaries of global warming and climate change have essentially led to shifting of the population and population leaving that particular region. And those who are staying back are facing the vagaries even further. Sundarbans, a large part of Sundarbans is, I mean, you simply cannot have agriculture out there. And as one form of mode of adaptation, they are moving to pisciculture and shrimp culture, because of the brackish water. Under brackish water, shrimp culture actually flourishes. But at the same time, to what extent that is going to flourish in the medium run, that remains a question. So anyway, these kinds of changes in hydrological regimes, which essentially dominated the traditional water governance paradigm, is readily being recognized in the developed world, especially in the United States of America, which they were the prime proponents of dam building between the 1920s and 1960s. They kept on building dams. And the Tennessee, just as our Damodar Valley Corporation is a replication of the Tennessee Valley Corporation, Tennessee Valley Project. So, but by the 1990s, in European Union and United States of America, around 500 dams were decommissioned. And by now, almost 2,000 dams have been decommissioned in US and US and the European Union, just by looking at the damages that they have caused to the downstream ecosystem and the implications on human livelihoods. So this is also something that has been happening, a phenomenon that has been happening in lower Mexico because of stream flow depletion from in the lower Colorado. In fact, what they also constructed out there was the Central Arizona project and diverting the water towards the desert areas. And eventually this turned out to be disastrous. Disastrous in the sense that in the Mexican Delta in lower Colorado, Colorado is also a transboundary river between US and Mexico, the stream flow depleted over time. And there you also again have sea level rise, which is leading to salinity ingression, which is again, in fact, leading to the entire destruction of paddy cultivation in that part of the world. And I just talked about the dying Sundarbans Delta. So, from the Neo-Malthusian creed, which essentially dominated the water governance paradigm, that it is scarcity and you have to address scarcity, the Malthusian responses have actually led to further complications. They have actually made the problems complex. So the conflict right now is not merely between, suppose you simply cannot think of a conflict between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, or a conflict between, say, Egypt and Ethiopia. It is not confined to that. It's a conflict much broader than that. It is not between two economies or two nations or two neighbors. It is between the short-term human economic needs and long-term human economic needs. Why I am using the term long-term human economic needs is that the ecosystem needs are synonymous with long-term human economic needs, and conservation or of the ecosystem is a selfish human economic need. Let me put this in this fashion. It's only that we need to have a longer term. So we may construct a dam or a barrage at this point in time, but that might be counterproductive for the economy as a whole in the longer term. So one has to factor in this time frame in the entire planning horizon and in the entire benefit cost ratio. So on the one hand, the conflict that is arising is a sectoral conflict, the economic sector and the ecosystem sector. And on the other hand, this conflict has a temporal dimension, the short-term economic demand vis-a-vis the long-term sustainability concerns. So that is precisely why I am calling this a war of paradigms. And this war of paradigms, which has been existing globally over the last 40 years, is now visible in India. In 2016, Ministry of Water Resources constituted a committee under Dr. Mihir Shah, who was a former member of the Planning Commission. Mihir Shah committee came up with a report on the new institutional structure for water governance. And that report specifically mentioned that the Central Water Commission should be dismantled and dissolved. The Central Groundwater Board should be dismantled and dissolved. And we should club these two and form a National Water Commission, which should be looking at water from an integrated approach, from an integrated perspective. It's a fact. There is no point, in fact, looking at groundwater and surface water as two different resources, because they are it's essentially the same resource. First of all, it's the surface water which might go down for underground and become and in fact flow underground for a few kilometers and then come up. So, and at a basin scale ecosystem approach, you simply cannot distinguish between the two. So the conflict that is arising right now is that the central water question, which is dominated only by engineers who feel that all the solutions of the world, all the water solutions, all the solutions to the problems of water in the world can be resolved through an engineering thinking, through only by constructing a barrage or a dam and stocking the water is the way, in fact, how you govern the resource. They keep on using this term. You have to train the river. I don't know how you can train the river. So that is why, in fact, in the United States of America, they are using this term wild rivers. A wild river is a free-flowing river. And if you have to train the river as if you are going to train the wild animal from the forest, and that is going to be disastrous, because that is what has been the disasters have been unfolding year after year, whether it is in the context of the Bihar floods, whether it is in the context of the Brahmaputra floods, whether it is in the context of the in fact in the Uttarakhand floods way back, and also in fact in the recent cases. One has to understand the nature of the river. It's very, very difficult. Now, our very own traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, understood the nature of floods. And that is precisely why they understood the ecosystem services of floods. They understood that when the flood water recedes, it lives behind rich alluvium, which has essentially made the Gangetic floodplain the rice bowl of South Asia. So is the case with Brahmaputra. Now, what has happened in the cases of Koshi is that a huge amount of numbers of embankments, which literally get breached every year, and you also have constructions on those embankments. Houses have been constructed in on those embankments. Similar is the case, in fact, with the lower Ganges. Similar is the cases, in fact, in the Brahmaputra. And then you show them that well, this so much is the loss in property, so much is the loss in life. So floods are disasters. So how do you combat them? You create more embankments. So you create more problems rather than solutions to actually essentially combat the problem. Now, floodplain zoning, this has been something that has been talked of. But how do you essentially understand the nature of the river, especially the Himalayan rivers, which keep on swinging their pathways? The course of the river, suppose say a river like Bagmati or Koshi, probably has moved around 40 degrees over the last 150 years. The Brahmaputra that we presently talk of is not really the original, the old Brahmaputra. This didn't exist maybe 450 or 500 years ago. And had it been the old Brahmaputra, it would not have been a transboundary river between Bangladesh and India. Possibly the old Brahmaputra course would have been entirely in India. So understanding the course of the river was there in our traditional knowledge system, and with the indigenous people who used to use the river optimally, using their ecosystem services optimally, but the 200 years of invasion of European engineering somehow led to some kind of what we call a rift, a metabolic rift between man and nature. Now, that is precisely why this dichotomy between the economic perception of water as a stock and the ecological perception of water as a flow in the hydrological cycle, this is the war of paradigms. And if we have to address these conflicts, then naturally it demands ecological knowledge for the identification and articulation of the ecosystem functions and services of every flow regime, which will need time. So, and globally, in fact, regulating the abstraction of water from rivers, lakes, and aquifers, there are clear restrictions. And how do we do that? How do we do that sustainably? It is not embedded, in fact, in one discipline, that is engineering. It is not embedded in the discipline of pure neoclassical economics, which looks at water as a stock of resource, just as if you are maximizing a production function. That is why your production as a function of water, and eventually so you can, this is the amount of water that you should be using, and then you have a constraint that W is less than W bar. This is not the way that you can really think of. There are various other parameters which you need to bring in. So what we have in India is a fragmented approach in river basin governance. And when in fact the Mihir committee report came out, there was a huge furor. Furor in the sense, the Central Water Commission essentially termed Mihir anti-national and anti-development. Lately, in fact, in 2020, a new committee was formed to draft the national water policy. That was again under Mihir. Now, the committee actually invited me to for certain consultations. And on the so after I made a presentation the very next day, in my column, I wrote an article on exactly with this title, Water Wars Over Paradigms. And eventually I talked about what is the significance of this particular committee, because this committee is a transdisciplinary committee, which has engineers, because you need engineers, you simply cannot do without them. You need ecological economists, you need sociologists, you need hydrologists, you need ecologists, you need geomorphologists, you need geographers. You need to create a transdisciplinary knowledge base. And when this article was published, in fact, in my column, which I used to write for Mail Today, the very next day I was in Colombo, I received an email from a pro in structural engineering institutions stating essentially in not so kind words, what is the problem with Mihir Shah and company? Well, this is something like a war that is going on over paradigms. And this is the water war that I am essentially referring to. The constructionist, engineering, reductionist ways of governing water and a holistic paradigm to govern water. So this entire British engineering thinking needs to be updated further and upgraded further with introduction of more disciplines. And the National Water Commission, which essentially Mihir talked of, was something like that. So this reductionism that essentially I have been talking of is, I have also referred to this as arithmetic hydrology, rather than as opposed to holistic ecohydrology. Why arithmetic hydrology? Because everything gets reduced to a number. What is the per capita availability? Oh, per capita availability is so low, then we have to address this. Then construct a dam out there and divert the water in here. So much is the footprint. You have to grow paddy in this particular region. You have to grow paddy. In fact, rice isn't paddy in the Kaveri and the Tista basin, whereas water is not available even for drinking. Water is not available even for the downstream ecosystem. So why not shift to other crops, which might be more profitable to the farmer and which is probably consumes 1/10 the amount of water. Now there is a clear problem, in fact, with the existing, or suppose whichever dispensation, whether it's existing or past dispensations, in order to work with the farmers. In fact, present dispensations, even if they wanted to bring about change, there have been few rules, but that's a different ball game altogether. But that is not with respect to water. So arithmetic hydrology is this particular paradigm which loses out on some of the more critical variables by just focusing on numbers. Number of water availability. It doesn't feature, in fact, what about sediments? What about fisheries? What about the broader social ecological variables? This prevalence of arithmetic hydrology in the Indian water governance paradigm is extremely visible when one thinks of river interlinking. The entire notion of river interlinking is based on the fallacy on transferring water from surplus river basins to deficit river basins. Now, what is surplus and what is deficit? Now, surplus and deficit river basins have been defined from the perspective of how much agricultural area can be irrigated and what is the per capita availability. Oh, so much water is going to the sea, then that is a waste. Nothing can be more ludicrous than that, because every drop of water has an ecosystem function, which eventually provides ecosystem service. At the same time, the entire ecological cost, the engineering cost, and the long-term economic cost of river interlinking has not been factored into the project. More importantly, the context of conflict. Now, when one is thinking about uh, especially the Manos-Shankos-Tista linkage from the northeast of India and bringing it to this, the Manos-Shankos-Tista Ganga linkage and bringing that to Farakka, to Ganga mainstream, one completely becomes oblivious of the fact that Manos contributes substantially to the Brahmaputra main flow. And not only that, this is going to result in lowering of the flows to Bangladesh, who definitely is going to cry foul. And that is going to be one of the stressors. In fact, in the Bangladesh-India relations, we are already having a stressor in the context of the Tista. That is, in fact, the fault belongs to both the nations. Unsustainable use of water. It is not that, and why when I'm talking of India, let's understand this very clearly, that uh, 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 this paradigm actually prevails all across South Asia, whether you talk of Pakistan, whether you talk of India, whether you talk of Bangladesh, whether you talk of Myanmar. So this is also because this entire region, we were British colonies. We are part of the innumerable British colonies, and British engineering thinking was brought in here. Then, in fact, you have this notion, apart from this river interlinking, which talks about surplus and deficit, because first of all, there cannot be anything surplus or deficit as far as nature is concerned, because it's an endowment. If you want to work on nature, nature is going to take its revenge. One has to remember that first. So ecologically, there is nothing surplus, nothing deficit. We have to work on them, eventually looking at what nature has endowed us with. One very critical element of bringing down the scarcity value of water is to work on the demand side indicators rather than the supply side interventions. Then comes the debate on environmental flows. That then there's, in fact, Ministry of Water Resources, the Ministry of Jal Shakti, long back from 2005-6, they started harping on this notion, environmental flows. So you have to leave so much water for the environment, 20%, 30%, 25%, sometimes 15%, without really understanding that what is the environmental water demand? How can we really decipher the fact that 15% is essentially the water demand for the environment? Now, the original IUCN document which talked about flows, they talked about a negotiated approach. You have to bring in a host of stakeholders together, including a stakeholder for the ecosystem. It has to be based on a transdisciplinary knowledge base. It has to be based on the social requirements. It has to be based on the economic requirements. And eventually you define the flow regime of a river. Now, in fact, in the United States of America, they have demarcated certain rivers as wild and free-flowing rivers. And recently, in fact, it was, I presume, last year in 2020, 2019 rather, last year, that there was a paper in Science mapping world's free-flowing rivers. Sorry, it was not in Science, it was in Nature. So this was a project taken up by WWF International and Stanford University. They mapped all the free-flowing rivers of the world. As far as India is concerned, probably we don't have any free-flowing rivers left. We only have stretches. One very critical stretch happens to be the Brahmaputra stretch after the Brahmaputra gets formed near Sadia in Assam and post Pasighat. Till, in fact, in Goalondo Ghat in Bangladesh, where there hasn't been any form of intervention in terms of construction of dams. So this very idea that water is a stock of resource to be stocked and used as per human convenience essentially is an example of arithmetic hydrology. Now let me come to the Kaveri discourse. Of course, we have talked about the hydropolitical relations between the princely state of Mysore and Madras presidency. The history goes long back. Host of ideas have been floated. They have not the economic origins of the conflict. Now, the economic origin, I will just come to that, but look at when in fact in 2007, the Kaveri Water Tribunal gave the final verdict, that is the award, that they call it the award. This is a classic example of arithmetic hydrology. So what they stated was that the total utilizable waters of the Kaveri for all the states was around they essentially depended on around 50% dependability, reserved to the tune of to 400 TMC for Tamil Nadu, to 270,000 million cubic feet for Karnataka, 30 TMC for Kerala, and then they reserve 10 TMC for environmental protection and 4 TMC for inevitable escapages to the sea. So as if 10 TMC is going to protect the environment and 4 TMC is for escape. This is going to go to the sea. Now, God knows from where they got this figure of 50% dependability. Of course, maybe in fact from previous engineering estimates of KL Rao and others who were legendary engineers, but somehow at that point in time, this entire notion of taking ecosystem into consideration didn't prevail. So this is a classic example of arithmetic hydrology, which do not really conform to global water literature, water governance literature. Then in fact, let us look at this entire issue that the government's inadvertent incentivization for paddy cultivation, which has been happening right from the 1960s, because the way we define food security, our food security has been delineated primarily through two crops, paddy and wheat. The Green Revolution essentially affected paddy and wheat, led to large scale production of paddy and wheat all across the country. It is considered to be a success, in fact, in the context of these two crops. Not only that, when the minimum support prices came into being from the 1970s, what was done was, it was done for 21 essential commodities, but the government procurement was primarily happening in paddy and wheat because of maintaining the buffer norms, and to a certain extent what the CSCP considered as coarse cereals, that is jowar, bajra and ragi. Apart from, suppose, say the pulses. Now, the minimum support price, what we often call the relative price, if you, or the terms of trade, this was increased over paddy at a much faster rate, paddy and wheat to be more precise, for both, between the 1980s and 90s at a much faster rate than what they call the coarse cereals, which require minimum, which are not really water guzzlers. Paddy requires around 2000 millimeters of water, whereas when it comes to ragi, it requires around 200, 1/10 the amount, both jowar, I mean all three of them, jowar, bajra and ragi. Now in the Karnataka part of the basin, till the 1960s and the 70s, ragi was a pretty dominant crop. But when in fact Karnataka started developing its irrigation potential and the minimum support prices were made to increase at a much faster rate, then in fact ragi was displaced and paddy took its position. And eventually the water consumption in that part of the basin increased substantially by almost 10 times. And not only that, they have 3 crops of paddy. The third crop is completely irrigated, that is the summer paddy. So they have to divert the water from the Kaveri, and eventually that increased the water stress. Similar is the case, in fact, in Tamil Nadu with irrigation potential, though they had the irrigation potential already developed at a pretty early stage. But even then, if you look at the data, particularly from the 80s till the 2010, you find that the water guzzlers like sugarcane, as also paddy, were grown in the Tamil Delta, and they became pretty dominant crops. So this was a very critical element that led to the conflict, also because of the fact that the Kuruvai crop of Tamil Nadu, which is essentially the which is sown during the non-monsoon period and harvested during the monsoon period, and the summer crop of Karnataka, which is entirely the irrigated crop of the non-monsoon period, they converged. The periods of harvesting of one and sowing of another converged. And you will find that throughout the 90s till 2010-11, in most cases, the conflict has been arising during the month of June, if the monsoons are not coming on time. That is when, in fact, in my previous research, I have shown when the scarcity value of water shot up substantially. So, of course, there are other problems in terms of delineation of the property rights, because if we look at three extreme principles of water allocation of property rights, these are Harmon, history, and Hobbes. Water Harmon doctrine essentially says if water falls on my roof, then it is mine. History talks of prior appropriation. That means if I am the person who has appropriated the water for the first time, then I definitely have the right over that resource. Whereas Hobbes talks about negotiations. So you negotiate and come to some kind of an arrangement related to property rights. Now, water falls in the state list subject to the provisions of 56(1) of the Indian Constitution. Since it is in the state list, states started defining the property rights over the resource in their own ways. Karnataka defines it in terms of the Harmon doctrine because they are the upstream nation. Water falls on my roof, so this is mine. Whereas Tamil Nadu, they were the ones who developed irrigation potential early and have been the early users of the water. Karnataka didn't have irrigation potential developed in the Kaveri Basin so early. So they defined the property rights in terms of history. In terms of the 1924 agreement of the Krishnaraja Sagara Dam, in fact, in Karnataka. So these two divergent definitions of property rights, given that the states can define the rights in their own manner, in their own ways, come in the ways. So this is not only a conflict over the water, but conflict in terms of the definition of the rights as well. Conflict is also arising because the Kaveri Delta is also shrinking like the Ganges Delta or the Colorado Delta, and there is not adequate water flow. So this is again a conflict between the economic and the ecosystem sectors. So whereas we needed a different kind of discourse to govern it, the award still sticks to a very quantitative arithmetic hydrology and engineering solutions, rather than looking at the temporal dimension of water allocation. So I have already talked about the Farakka, but there is another critical element that I must mention. That is in fact, as you can see, the Farakka Barrage and the feeder canal in here, through which essentially the water is made to flow, water of the Ganga is made to flow through the Bhagirathi Hooghly. But this also created another tension between Bangladesh and India. And naturally, that is precisely why we had to have the flow in Bangladesh diminished during the dry season, and we have the 1996 agreement, Ganga Water Agreement between Bangladesh and India, which essentially talks about 7-day schedule of flows depending on a particular quantity. Again here, the concern of sediments have not been brought into the fold in 1996. The other problem that is arising because of sediments is that there has been a huge accumulation of sediment in the upstream of the Farakka Barrage. And it is to the extent that a normal dredger cannot address this concern. And there is a cascading impact of sediment. Now, when in fact the floods from Koshi, which is a tributary of the Ganga flowing from Nepal to Bihar, essentially the high flows in the Koshi essentially emerge, and you also have high flows from the Ganga emerging. And when these two high flows converge during high monsoon, what happens is that you already have a huge cascading impact of the sediments, which is acting as a barrier. Both of them hit that barrier, and there is a rebound effect. And this essentially aggravates the flood conflict, the backwardation or the backward flows. So in fact, in 2016 and 17, Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar stated that the Farakka Barrage should be dismantled. But there is another aspect to it. If somebody intends to do a proper cost-benefit analysis entailing the economic and ecosystem services values and damages caused or the costs of the Farakka Barrage, one will also be able to make out that this large part of Kolkata and non-tidal West Bengal is water secure is also because of the Farakka Barrage, because of this diversion. And this is also resuscitating the groundwater levels as far as non-tidal parts of West Bengal are concerned. So from that perspective, dismantling of the Farakka Barrage remains a contentious issue. So this is what we often call, in fact, in international geopolitics, a two-level game. That the governments are playing a two-level game. The same thing prevails in the case of Tista. The government has to play a two-level game. On the one hand, in fact, they want to get into, the central government wants to get into some kind of an agreement with Bangladesh with Tista, but there is clear objection from West Bengal that there is not much water over Tista, which essentially we can dispense with. So this is a very, very critical issue. And without essentially taking the state into confidence, you simply cannot get into an international agreement. So let me just talk about some of the important tenets of the new paradigm that we are talking of, that I'm talking of. Water should be viewed as an integral component of the global hydrological cycle and not merely as a stock of material resource to be used for human satisfaction, for human requirements. A. B. Supply of ever-increasing volumes of water is not a prerequisite for continued economic growth and food security. There are enough ways, practices, and technology that talk of more food, less drop. So more crop per drop. These are, in fact, the new thinking. Water and food are already delinked in the new heterodox economics of agriculture as also water, and better practices can ensure more crop per drop. Clear and strict prioritization of various types of needs and demand for water is needed, including those of the ecosystems. We need to have a comprehensive assessment of water development projects. So we cannot indiscriminately think about having a dam or a barrage, which China might be thinking of, in fact, at the border of the Arunachal Pradesh, that has a different ecological and hydropolitical connotation, which we have, I'm not going to talk of now, but if there are questions, I can talk of it. So ecological economics has to be a pivotal discipline for such assessments, and a new transdisciplinary framework for such assessment needs to be adopted. There's a need for an interdisciplinary knowledge base, which I have been harping upon. If more importantly, we need to have an institution which have to think about a river basin as an ecosystem and indulge in ecosystem governance. And for that, that institution should be based on a transdisciplinary knowledge base. And basin ecosystem should be the unit of governance. It's not merely a stretch of the basin. You simply cannot think about that. I'm going to talk about a Bangladesh-India Joint Rivers Commission only to look at a component of from the Farakka to Hardinge Beach. If you have to have so what happens, in fact, when there is some kind of an upstream intervention, maybe in Nepal, maybe in Uttarakhand. So there has to be a basin level approach, which can holistically look at the basin with a bird's eye view and eventually take critical decisions. And the river flow should be associated in association with sediments and the ecosystems associated. More importantly, appropriate institutional mechanism, if you at all have to think of river basin organization. This is extremely critical, a basin as an ecosystem and the unit of governance. And need for shifting to a new globally accepted state-of-art definition of environmental flows, replacing the presently followed arithmetic hydrological definition, which barely entails percentage of the flow, as if the court has said that you have to leave this percentage and I'm giving this percentage, but that is not sufficient for the ecosystem. A better scientific analysis is needed. The literature is already emerging globally. We have to adopt those. We cannot leave it only to the civil engineers. So this is the new economics of water that I intend to talk of. This is a clear departure from the neoclassical economic ways of looking at water as a stock of resource. Human society is a component of the broader ecosystem, and holistic interactivities of the human system with the hydrological cycles need to be looked at. Economic instruments like valuation of ecosystem services, long-term losses due to human interventions are all plugged into holistic cost-benefit analysis. I'll just show you a figure. In fact, this is something, a study that was conducted in 2018 by all of us when I was advising in the IWMI, International Water Management Institute, at the WWF International. So this is on the stretch of the Upper Ganges Canal, in the between the Himgora and Narora, what we did was we put across a value to the existing flow regime in terms of the values of the ecosystem services. And then in fact, what do we need to do if we at all have to achieve the e-flows regime or the environmental flows regime? If we release certain amount of water to the, and for the environment, what happens to the farmer? What happens to the overall ecosystem services values? What we found there was that throughout the year, the water that needs to be released has to be from the irrigation sector only, because 90 to 95% of the total water between the upper Ganges and the lower Ganges canal is being used for irrigation. And barely 5 to 7% is going for other needs like, say, urban needs or suppose a household or suppose a industrial needs. Given that the total water abstraction is at Narora is 6145 million cubic meters, the combined deficit from the e-flows is barely 2.2% of the total abstraction. So what we did was that we put across a value, a monetary value to the existing flow regime in 2015 for 2015-16 between Bhimgora and Narora, on what is the value of water in that particular region, whether it's for agriculture, whether it's for religious tourism, supporting the green cover for carbon sequestration, microclimate regulation, so on and so forth, riverbed farming. And that turned out, we used a host of methods, including the production function approaches with econometric methods, the avoided cost approaches, then in fact the social cost approach. And eventually we found that in 15-16, this value, this is a very, very conservative estimate. It might be 20 times more than this because we covered only a few ecosystem services. It was 874 billion for one particular year. Now, if this is the value of the flow regime, and if we have two interventions in the upper Ganges canal, especially in fact upstream of Narora, then in fact these interventions might use water use efficiency and yield enhancement and crop diversification. These are the scenarios, scenario A, B, C, D. Water use efficiency enhanced by 1%, scenario B, water use efficiency enhanced by 0.5%, yield is increased by 1%, so on and so forth. And then you have the other scenarios. If suppose from wheat we move to sorghum, what happens? What happens was that we find that the value of the flow regime increases as more water gets released for the ecosystem. As crop diversification is happening and yield enhancement is happening, this is also through better soil management practices. The farmer gets benefited by using less water. We are releasing more water to meet the environmental flows needs, and the water extraction also declines. This exactly goes by the saying, more crop per drop. So the best scenario that we find is emerges as scenario B, that reveals the highest value of the flow regime, highest value for the farmer, as also in fact making the inflows required. That is, water use efficiency increases by 0.5% and yield increases by 1%. So when we combine scenario B and scenario F, that is 2% decline in area of wheat, which is being taken up by sorghum, we find that that is the best case by doing both together. So, so this is what I intend to harp on, that we have to, when it comes to water governance, we are dealing with a very critical trinity of equity, efficiency, and sustainability. This is something that I have called the irreconcilable trinity, that it is not merely the social equity, not merely the efficient part in terms of your return, but if you look at SDGs, they talk about the sustainable development goals. They talk essentially about reconciling between this irreconcilable trinity together. And that is why we need to take into consideration the space and time. We need to consider the ecological space. We need to consider the hydrological space. We need to consider the socio-economic space. We need to consider the hydropolitics and the geopolitics space. And eventually, look at the institutional mechanism which is going to combine and reconcile between the conflicting goals. So once the goals are given, and for that we need a transdisciplinary knowledge base and yet very specific instruments which are provided from the body of the ecological economic literature as also holistic engineering. So that is why, in fact, this is the schematic diagram that I'd like to harp on: economic, social, and environmental, which is emphasizing on efficiency, equity, and sustainability. And this institutional framework, a river basin organization, has to have a proper knowledge base created and put across that knowledge and information in public domain. And this is something extremely critical as far as South Asian water governance is concerned. In most cases, data have been classified, especially when we talk about transboundary rivers. And this has been done mostly on the Indian part, because when I went to the website, in fact, of the Joint Rivers Commission, or asked the Joint Rivers Commission in Bangladesh, they were pretty free in giving me the data that they are receiving in of the Farakka, of the water released from Farakka and received at Hardinge Beach. So these are the knowledge gaps that we need to bridge on: institutional void, eco-hydrological knowledge, flood management, gaps in the social dimensions of water use and local governance, the diverse demands, more importantly, understanding the complex nature of the Himalayan system. Peninsular systems, whatever they claim, in fact, in Gujarat and Maharashtra, as also in fact in Tamil Nadu by most of the hydrologists, is much, much simpler. So when they are thinking about interlinking the Himalayan water system with the peninsular river system, one needs to have a much, much better understanding on what exactly is the sediment science in here, what exactly is the hydrological science in here, what is the, and more importantly, see, as far as the peninsular rivers are concerned, they do not cross international boundaries. Most of the Himalayan rivers cross international boundaries, at least the large rivers, whether it is the Indus or the Ganga or the Brahmaputra. And there is an international dimension attached to it. So this is something that is hardly understood, and often they are getting equated when one looks through the reductionist lens of engineering and neoclassical economics. Nature of seismic risks in the Himalaya, the impact of the structural interventions, then the mechanism and generation and draining out of the flood waters. How are the sediments generated? How are they transported? How are they deposited? This is still a knowledge gap. We need to bridge these knowledge gaps. More importantly, the seismic science. And finally, the threat point of global warming and climate change. What is happening, in fact, in the glaciers and their eventual impact on the water availability in the downstream in the delta, that is clearly a void at this point in time. Different models are stating different things. So we really have to acknowledge these knowledge gaps if we at all have to have a proper governance mechanism in the form of the right kind of institution. So let me end with this slide, that we need this paradigm shift. The war is going on between those who are essentially propagating this paradigm shift and those who intend to cling on the brick and mortar institutions or the thoughts propagated by the brick and mortar institutions like the Central Water Commission. The 2016 Mihir Shah Committee report acknowledges this shift. Then there was an issue, in fact, which came out in EPW in 2016, where some of the water governance experts, including me, were essentially asked to critique the 2016 report. But after that, the entire report has been placed under the carpet. So the governance structures, processes, and institutions, they have to imbibe this multidisciplinary thinking. So I'm having enough hope that the new national water, committee that has been set up for national water policy, which has been taking my inputs quite often. In fact, they've been asking for inputs and presentations quite often. They are going to take up quite a few components of this particular presentation that I just made before you. There are some of the critical trade-offs that one needs to understand in here, but the challenge also lies with essentially reconciling between the trade-offs of the economic need and the ecosystem need, or the short-term economic needs and the long-term economic needs. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation. I don't mind having a few questions, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for really insightful and detailed session. This has been a raging debate over the years, and it's been amazing how you've touched upon the different strands of literature of water wars in such lucid and I would say watery terms. So I'll ask people if they have questions. I mean, if anyone has his or her questions, please feel free to ask Professor Ghosh. Uh, Before I see questions coming, sir, I mean, uh, I mean, you've talked about the politicization of water wars to a large extent. How do you think this is going to be aggravated by, say, tense bilateral relationships? Say that, I mean, something what we have between India and Pakistan. For example, Pakistan is a seriously water-stressed nation. And how serious are the implications for, say, Pakistan of diversions of water flow in this context?
See, first of all, one has to understand the headwaters as far as Indus is concerned. The headwaters of the Indus, let's face it, is in China. Will that change the dynamics if India, in fact, offers anything in here from this side that we are going to stop the waters? India, first of all, of course, blood and water cannot flow together. This has been a statement from our primer. But from another perspective, this is not going to be a sustainable solution even for India to stop the waters. First of all, there is going to be a different kind of application. Now, let's face it, that India is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Non-Navigational Water Use. That doesn't mean that India, which essentially talks of the fact that you have to abide by some of the downstream concerns, or suppose you cannot stop water. The fact remains that there will be immense international pressure. You might lose out on some of your friends. So water is not merely a concern of hydropolitics. Water is a broader concern of geostrategy and geopolitics. So on the other hand, if you look at Indus, when it comes to the adjudication, now who essentially made this, sweetened up this Indus deal? It was the World Bank. There was third party involved. It is not the case as far as Farakka is concerned. It's a different ballgame. But the case of Indus is much more complicated than that for India to really renege from the treaty. Then you have the adjudicator in the form of the MIT president. So the third party pressure is very much there as far as India is concerned. Now, when it comes to water, see, stopping the water is also, or maybe constructing a barrage in those high altitude is not really an ecologically sustainable solution, even whether you do it in Kashmir or Ladakh or wherever. It's not really an ecologically sustainable solution given the nature of seismicity in that particular region. And there will be backwater effects as well. There will be flooding in that particular region. So the costs also have to be borne. So definitely, from in the geostrategic space, India is definitely having an upper hand. But if water is made a weapon, then it might lose out on that. So one has to keep that into consideration. Of course, the Indian strategists, they know of this. And that is why they are never going to weaponize water. And even in the case of, suppose, the Brahmaputra, India is going to have an upper hand. First of all, I'm not going to harp on this, but the capacity of China to affect India because of the natural flow element is nominal. Large component of the Brahmaputra, almost 70 to 80% of the Brahmaputra is made in India. Though 55% of the length of the Brahmaputra is in Tibet, that is in China, and 55-56%, and 30% is in India, 15% is in Bangladesh, but 70% of the flow emerges in India, of which, as far as potential utilizability of the Brahmaputra is concerned, it's barely 20-21%. So we are not utilizing Brahmaputra totally. So whatever we are receiving from Sadia, that itself is sufficient. If China constructs a dam, in fact, in Medog, which is just beyond the Indian boundary, there will be some impact on Arunachal, but not beyond that. Not beyond that, not beyond the Siang district. I think there is another hand that has come up. There are some other questions. Should I respond to the hand? Yes, Nilanjan Ghosh.
I've got a question, Dr. Ghosh. I really appreciate what you have talked about, but my basic, there's a big question, that there is our federal system of country, there is particularly huge conflict between center and the state. This is number one. Number two, in fact, in the neighboring countries also, there are some conflict. So how do you think, in what perspective, this sort of, the paradigm shift and all these things is it possible to take care of all these things? Because the peculiar sort of constitution we're having in particular a country like India, where the state enjoys equal power, more or less like center. So how do you conceive this sort of thing before making this sort of, it's a very well thought, well constructed, beautiful talks, I really appreciate. But how do you consider all these things when there is a conflict between center and the state? And what is your idea about how to mitigate all these things? On that perspective, I really request your suggestion. How do we get rid of all these things?
This is a very, very crucial concern. First of all, I mentioned something called the two-level game. The first game is between which suppose a central government has to play when it comes to water. The first is, of course, at an international level, maybe Bangladesh, India, and something like that. The other is at the very national level between the states. The entire problem of water governance, also the fragmented nature of water governance. I use this term fragmented nature as opposed to integrated nature. This fragmentation essentially has its roots in the Indian Constitution. You are absolutely correct. Because water is a state subject in the Indian Constitution. Once you make water a state subject, that is precisely why you are having this Kaveri water conflict. Let's face it. Now there are certain provisions by way of which the center can actually intervene. That is because it states subject to Article 56(1) of the Indian Constitution. Now this Article 56(1) of the Indian Constitution essentially allows the center to intervene in some way or the other. Now, in most of these conflictual river basins, what has been the role of the center? Center somehow didn't want to intervene. All they did was to set up a tribunal. And the tribunal infested with engineers who have actually aggravated these conflicts further, without really understanding the nature of the conflict, without even understanding the economics of the conflict. The Kaveri water conflict is all about economics, as also the history.
Absolutely correct.
So now when it comes to that, the first and foremost thing is that you have to have a river basin organization, RBO. Now, if you have to have an RBO, there has to be a special provision in which the essentially has to be a special act has to be passed in terms of an amendment of the Constitution that under these conflictual situations, a river basin organization, which essentially Mihir Committee report has also talked of, is going to be constituted. And that river basin organization should have representatives from both the states. Maybe, in fact, the way, in fact, transboundary international river basin organizations are essentially thought of, just as you have in the case of Mekong, you have in the case of the Danube, you have in the case of the Indus, or you have in the case of, suppose, say, some other river basin organizations. So out here, you should have maybe the chief, the water minister, the minister of water resources prevailing as the president. Then, in fact, the irrigation ministers of both the states being members, the environment ministers of both the states being members. Then you have a neutral body of engineers, scientists, and whosoever working on various issues of this river, particular river basin. And that is the only way when you can integrate and get an integrated approach. And this is essentially what we have been prescribing. That treats the Kaveri Basin, treats the Krishna Basin, or treats the Godavari Basin or the Narmada as a basin ecosystem. And this river basin organization should be autonomous. It should have the teeth essentially to penalize that stakeholder who reneges from the particular position which has been decided upon.
I got another question. Do you think that since I came to know that you are also one of the member of the advisory board under the chairmanship of Supreme Court regarding the forest and all these things, why don't you think that this sort of the paradigm regarding the rivers and other things and the conflict among the states and all these things should come under the purview of that committee?
Well, that is only on trees, but definitely the broader ecosystem comes under the purview of because one has to take across the broader. Trees cannot survive without water, and trees cannot survive without the broader ecosystem into consideration. So definitely this integration has to be thought of over time. So that is something that the committee is already pondering upon.
I think it should be. Otherwise, it will be a futile job for this committee to conserve the forest and all these things. Thank you very much, Dr.
That is why we are talking of an ecosystems approach. By the basin comprises of the forest also. The basin comprises of the agricultural field also. So that is precisely why it's not merely the water that we are going to govern.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
I think there is a question from ASI. Is there a connection between dietary behavior and water governance in terms of agricultural production system? Yes, it is. There is definitely a connection. No doubt about that. And first of all, what has happened over time is that the choices and preferences of consumers also shifted, in fact, to a large extent in many parts of India to the water guzzling staples like rice and wheat, especially to rice. In the 1960s and the 70s, in fact, there were some traditional, especially in Karnataka, not only 60s and 70s, but this has been historically this prevailed, in fact, in Karnataka, that ragi used to be a major crop because that was also a crop of choice. They used to, ragi was a major staple, in fact, in many parts of Karnataka. But somehow, first of all, the price effect, then the availability effect, both resulted in displacing ragi and from the agricultural acreage, and that has been invaded by rice or paddy. So dietary behavior definitely affects, it's the demand side, demand pool, that is definitely going to affect the acreage decisions of the farmers, because if suppose there is a sudden rise in demand for less water consuming crops, then eventually the market system by itself is going to dictate the acreage decisions. That might not happen instantaneously. Because let me also give you an example. The Commission on Agricultural Costs and Prices, ever since 2017, 18, 19, they have been increasing the price of ragi at a much higher rate than the price of rice. In especially for the Rabi crop in 2018, 2019, the price of ragi was increased by almost 55%, whereas the price of rice was increased by only 5%. That means there is an attempt to produce ragi so as to conserve groundwater. So that, farmers take decisions. It might not be instantaneous, but with a 3-year or a 5-year cycle, at least in the longer term, you can incentivize farmers to take a decision on the other side, so that they shift to paddy or something else, to ragi or something else. That is essentially the idea.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Dr. Ghosh? I don't see any other questions coming up. I just had another question, sir, regarding data. So, I mean, how robust is the data you think in the effective monitoring and management for water governance? Are there any kind of, say, early warning systems to help predict potential water conflicts and for raising awareness among policymakers?
See, data is, there are two ways that you have to look at this data. First of all, when it comes to the flow data, it is available as far as water flow data. Sediment data, that is also in fact needs to be measured, modeled, but available. Species data, absolutely pathetic. We don't even know how many Gangetic dolphins are there. Whether the entire e-flows regime that the river needs so much of water, that needs to be maintained with a reference to a particular umbrella species like the Gangetic dolphin or the hill shark, that is not known. Has there been any stock assessment of the hill shark? When? Probably years ago. Forget dolphins, we don't even know how many species are there. When it comes to terrestrial data, terrestrial species data, we are doing a much more decent job than what we have been doing in the context of the aquatic species. So that is precisely why, when we have to take some of the more critical decisions with respect to water governance, we cannot really confine ourselves with the human needs, the economic needs, and the social needs. We have to bring in the religious needs. They do that often. Suppose when it comes to this particular Ganga Snan during the Kumbh, extra water so far has used to be released from the Tehri Dam. So, and eventually at Bhimgora, you receive an extra volume of water. Then in fact, now what is the value of water for this? You cannot really monetize that. But there are certain aspects which need to be monetized in terms of the ecosystem services. If until and unless we have so many dolphins in the system, in the river itself, in the freshwater itself, probably the ecosystem cannot be maintained. And eventually, if the ecosystem is destroyed, if the umbrella species is destroyed, then naturally there will be an impact on the entire ecosystem balance, and eventually we might lose out on the ecosystem structure, processes, and humans lose out on the long-term ecosystem services. The forest might not be there, the carbon sequestration might not happen. So these are some of the social costs that we have to bear. That is precisely why in the longer term, the entire concern of environment has to be plugged into water governance. So that is why I'm always harping on this fact that it is not that you can think of it from a very Malthusian perspective. It is much, much beyond that. Sorry, ASI seems Oshi, I presume, right? Later on I saw this name. Okay.
Yeah.
I felt it's.
I think.
Okay,
I think we've come to the end of the session. It's been a delightful session. I just hope after COVID, which has exposed our fragilities in the health sector, we are not waiting for a similar climate change crisis to raise the consciousness of, say, water wars among the policymakers. So thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for taking out such a long time for the session. We really enjoyed it. And the session will be uploaded on YouTube. We'll share the link with you over the mail.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.